He had money, properties, and silence, but not peace. And then came the woman with a wooden spoon and a quiet smile, who didn't just cook for him. She brought him back to life. Keep watching, because what happened next is proof that even the loneliest heart can be stirred back to warmth, bite by bite. In the heart of London, nestled behind tall wrought-iron gates, stood a grand Victorian mansion. It was the kind of place tourists paused to admire, wondering who lived there and what kind of life unfolded behind the heavy oak doors. But few knew that inside, silence reigned. Henry Whitmore, billionaire real estate tycoon and one of the most powerful men in England, lived alone in that mansion. Once it had been a home filled with warmth and laughter. Now it was little more than a beautifully furnished mausoleum. 6 years had passed since his wife Eleanor had died suddenly. Since then, Henry had buried himself in work and distanced himself from everything that once mattered. Each morning was the same. He would walk down the sweeping staircase, his footsteps echoing in the marble foyer. Breakfast, if it could be called that, consisted of black coffee and cold toast delivered by catering staff. He barely looked at it, lost in reports and emails. Conversations were kept to a minimum, mostly nods and curt replies to his assistant Oliver. But Oliver had grown tired of watching his employer fade into routine and grief. For months, he had gently suggested changes, bringing in a proper housekeeper, opening the home again, even hiring a personal chef. Henry always dismissed the ideas with a wave of his hand, until one rainy Tuesday morning, Oliver entered the office, holding a clipboard. "I've taken the liberty of hiring a cook," he announced. Henry glanced up. "You did what?" "She starts tomorrow," Oliver said matter-of-factly. "You need more than caffeine and silence, sir." Henry raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Part of him wanted to protest, but another part, buried deep under layers of detachment, was simply too tired to argue. That night Henry walked the dimly lit halls of the house. The paintings stared down from their frames, as if questioning his choices. He paused at the closed door of the dining room, once the scene of lavish dinners and laughter, now covered in dust. In his bedroom, he poured himself a small scotch and stared at the rain streaking down the windows. What difference would a cook make? Probably none. He didn't want companionship, and he certainly didn't need someone meddling with his meals. Still, as he lay in bed listening to the thunder roll over the city, he couldn't shake Oliver's words. "She starts tomorrow." Aye, he exhaled deeply. Whatever. If she didn't last a week, he wouldn't be surprised. What Henry didn't know was that the next morning, a woman with a warm smile and a recipe for steak and ale pie would step into his kitchen, and that everything he thought he knew about life, love, and happiness was about to change forever. The next morning, the rain had given way to a pale London sky. The air still held a chill, and mist curled along the edges of the private drive as a black taxi pulled up outside the mansion. From it stepped Grace Thompson. She was 28, with auburn hair tucked under a knitted hat and soft, intelligent eyes that carried both gentleness and quiet strength. Dressed in a worn peacoat and brown leather boots, she clutched a single suitcase and a cloth tote bag filled with cookbooks and a neatly folded floral apron. The driver looked up at the mansion's imposing stone facade. "You sure this is the place, miss?" Grace smiled. "I suppose we're about to find out." Oliver greeted her at the door. He was surprised by how young and calm she looked. Most applicants had come stiff and intimidated. She, on the other hand, looked more curious than afraid. "I'm Oliver," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Mr. Whitmore won't be greeting you this morning, but I'll show you to the kitchen." Grace followed him through grand hallways, lined with portraits and heavy curtains. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and old paper. The mansion, despite its beauty, felt abandoned, not in the literal sense, but in spirit. The kitchen, though massive and gleaming, was cold. The marble countertops had no flour dust. The pans hung like untouched ornaments, and the oven looked like it hadn't been used in months. Grace set her bag down and took off her coat. "This kitchen has good bones," she said softly, running her fingers along the countertop. "It just needs a little life." Without waiting for further instruction, she tied on her apron and got to work. She started with a proper English breakfast: scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, grilled tomatoes, and black pudding, but added her own flair: fresh herbs, baked mushrooms, and hand-rolled scones, still steaming from the oven. Then came the steak and ale pie, her grandmother's recipe perfected over the years. The scent of thyme, stout, and slow-cooked beef began to rise through the halls. Upstairs in his office, Henry paused mid-sentence on a call. There was something strange, a smell, not the sterile scent of delivered food, but something warm, nostalgic. Curious, he followed the aroma down the staircase. As he entered the kitchen, he saw her, stirring the pot with practiced rhythm, humming softly to herself. She turned around and offered a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. I hope I'm not disturbing." He stared at her for a moment, caught off guard. "No, He cleared his throat. "I wasn't expecting—" He trailed off as his eyes landed on the table: warm food, steam curling upward, and scones arranged on a ceramic plate like an old countryside inn. "Would you like to try something?" she asked gently. Henry hesitated, then sat. One bite of the pie stopped him cold. It wasn't just food, it was memory, warmth. It was the first thing that had tasted like home in years. He didn't say thank you, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't eat alone. By the third day, Henry had started to notice something else beyond the food: the rhythm of Grace's presence, her steps in the hallway, the faint hum of her voice while she cooked, the soft clinking of ceramic as she arranged the table. She wasn't loud or intrusive, but she filled the house in a way that was noticeable. That afternoon, as the city settled into its usual grey drizzle, a new aroma wafted through the halls. Something sweet, buttery, familiar. Scones. Henry barely looked up from his work until the scent hit him fully. Then came the faint sound of porcelain on wood, of tea being poured. He stood slowly, curiosity tugging at him. Descending the stairs, he followed the warmth to the dining room, where he hadn't sat for tea in over a decade. There, on a side table near the window, was a classic British tea setup: a teapot with delicate floral designs, 2 teacups, a silver tray with lemon slices, small jars of jam, clotted cream, and a plate stacked high with golden scones. Grace was standing by the window, watching the rain. When she saw him, she smiled. "I didn't mean to interrupt your day, Mr. Whitmore. It's just where I come from. We still honor the 5 o'clock tea." He glanced at the table, hesitant. "It's been years since I've had proper tea," he admitted. "Then it's long overdue." She gestured to a chair. Henry sat cautiously, watching as she poured the tea with a calm confidence that reminded him of his late grandmother. Grace offered him a scone. He split it open, steam escaping, and spread the clotted cream and jam as he remembered from childhood. The first bite caught him off guard. It was perfect, warm, lightly sweet, just crumbly enough to melt in the mouth. "I use my mother's recipe," Grace said, as if reading his thoughts. She believed food wasn't just nourishment. It was a way to say, "I see you, you matter." Henry looked up. "That's a rare philosophy these days." Grace shrugged gently. "I suppose. But I believe it's the little things that build a home." The conversation didn't stretch much beyond that. No deep confessions, no probing questions, just tea, rain, and 2 people sharing a table in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. After finishing, Henry stood and offered a quiet, "Thank you." Grace simply nodded. "Anytime." As he returned upstairs, something about that tea sat heavier in his chest than in his stomach. It wasn't about the food, it was the ritual, the moment, the sense that someone had prepared it for him, not out of obligation, but intention. Later that night, when Oliver checked in, Henry surprised him. "Tomorrow," Henry said, "make sure the tea room is cleaned, and ask Grace if she'll continue the 5 o'clock tradition." Oliver blinked, hiding a small smile. "Of course, sir." The house remained silent, but somehow it no longer felt quite so empty. A week had passed, and Grace had become part of the house's rhythm in a way no one had expected, especially not Henry. She didn't fill the mansion with noise, but rather with warmth. Each day at 5, she served tea and scones, and each evening she prepared dinner with the kind of care most chefs reserved for loved ones. The air always carried something new: rosemary, roasted root vegetables, the scent of fresh bread, or slow-cooked stews that reminded Henry of a world outside his empire. At first, Henry limited himself to silent appreciation, but little by little, words began to slip into the silence. It started with questions about ingredients, then brief remarks about the weather, and now full sentences shared over bowls of hot soup and the occasional glass of red wine. It was during one such dinner that Grace told him about her hometown. "Lynmouth," she said, serving leek and potato soup into ceramic bowls. "Small coastal village in Devon. Everyone knows everyone. The kind of place where the baker leaves your order on your doorstep before you even ask." Henry smiled faintly. "Sounds like a postcard." Grace chuckled. "It's not perfect. It rains constantly. Mobile signal's awful, but there's something about it. Simple. People look out for each other." Henry stirred his soup slowly, listening more intently than he expected to. "And your family?" he asked. "My mum passed when I was 20. She taught me to cook. Dad runs a bookshop by the sea, and my gran lives 2 doors down from the church and claims she can tell the weather better than the forecast." Henry smiled for real this time. "I'd believe her," Grace grinned. "You'd get along with her. She doesn't trust billionaires either." Henry laughed, genuinely, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. Grace looked up, surprised and quietly pleased. "And you?" she asked gently. "Did you grow up in London?" He hesitated. "Partly. My parents sent me to boarding school young. Summers with my grandmother in Yorkshire were the only parts that felt like home." He didn't elaborate. But Grace didn't push. She only nodded and continued eating. Later, as she cleared the dishes, Henry remained seated, unusually still. "My grandmother used to make a stew," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Beef, carrots, Guinness. I've tried to find something close for years. Nothing ever came close." Grace looked at him thoughtfully. "Was it for Sunday lunch?" He nodded. "Then I think I might have an idea." She turned back to the sink, humming softly, the steam from the dishes rising around her like mist on a Devon morning. That night, as Henry stood by the window in his study, he realized something. He'd spent years surrounded by people who feared him, obeyed him, or envied him. But now in his own home, there was finally someone who simply saw him. The following evening, Henry returned from a long day of meetings to a scent that stopped him at the door. It was rich and deep, something hearty, warm, and unmistakably familiar. He stepped into the entrance hall and closed the door behind him slowly, breathing it in. It wasn't just stew. It was that stew. He followed the aroma through the hallway, past the grand staircase and into the kitchen, where the lights were low and the table was already set. Grace stood by the stove, ladling thick, dark stew into ceramic bowls. Chunks of tender beef floated beside soft carrots, potatoes, and fresh herbs. The smell pulled him back through time, back to a farmhouse kitchen in Yorkshire. Rain outside, fire crackling, his grandmother's humming voice as she stirred the pot. Grace looked over her shoulder and smiled. "I hope I got it right." Henry stood still, his throat tight. "I thought you might want something familiar tonight," she continued gently. "I remembered how you described it." He sat down without a word. She placed a bowl in front of him, then took her seat across the table. The first spoonful stunned him. The second nearly made his eyes water. It was nearly identical. "How did you do this?" he asked, voice quieter than usual. Grace shrugged modestly. "You said your gran used Guinness, that she added carrots late so they stayed firm. and that the time was always strong at the finish. I just listened. Henry set his spoon down for a moment. No one's made this since she died. I tried to find chefs who could recreate it. None came close. Maybe they were listening to the ingredients, Grace said gently. But not to you. That line stayed with him. After dinner, they lingered longer than usual, sipping tea. The conversation drifted to old memories. Henry found himself speaking about his childhood summers, catching frogs by the stream, sneaking sips of his grand's ale, learning to play chess by the fireplace. Grace laughed at all the right parts. She didn't pity him. She didn't ask about the tragedy of his wife's passing, though the house whispered that story in every corner. She just listened. As she cleared the table, he stopped her. "Leave the dishes. Stay for a few minutes?" She hesitated only a moment before sitting back down. They sat in companionable silence, the smell of stew still hanging in the air like a memory that refused to fade. Later, as Henry climbed the stairs to his study, he paused halfway and looked back down the corridor. For the first time in 6 years, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a home again, and all it had taken was a cook who listened. Not to his wealth, not to his reputation, but to his heart. The storm rolled in just after sunset. Not a gentle drizzle, but a full downpour. Sheets of rain hammered against the windows of the mansion, and wind howled through the chimneys like an old ghost finally given voice. Henry had just returned home when the lights flickered once, twice, then vanished. A sudden hush filled the house, interrupted only by the rumble of thunder in the distance. He stood in the foyer, coat damp, adjusting to the darkness. For the first time in years, the silence felt different, not oppressive, just alive. "Mr. Whitmore." Grace's voice echoed from the hallway. "I'm here," he answered, stepping toward the kitchen. She emerged holding a pair of candles in tall brass holders. The warm glow lit her face, casting soft shadows across her cheekbones. She was barefoot, her hair slightly messy from the kitchen's humidity. "The fuse box isn't the problem," she said. "I think the whole block's lost power." Henry nodded. "First time this place has gone dark since I moved in." Grace smiled. "Then it's about time. Some things only come to life when the lights go out." He chuckled at that. She handed him a candle. "Fire's already lit in the kitchen fireplace. Come on, I've got soup on the stove, still hot." The kitchen was transformed. With the flickering fire and candlelight, it felt like something out of a countryside inn. Cozy, timeless. On the wooden table sat 2 steaming bowls of lentil and tomato soup, warm rolls wrapped in linen, and mugs of peppermint tea. They sat across from each other, and the flickering flames filled the silence. "I used to be afraid of the dark," Henry said, surprising even himself. Grace glanced up. "As a child?" He nodded. "And as an adult. But not of the dark itself, of what I might feel in it." She waited quietly, letting him continue at his own pace. "After Eleanor died, I kept the house lit at all hours. Candles, lamps, hallway lights. The quiet was unbearable." Grace looked into his eyes, her voice soft. "The quiet makes everything louder, doesn't it?" He gave a small nod. "And yet tonight it feels bearable." They ate in silence for a while, interrupted only by the crackling fire and the steady rhythm of rain on glass. After the meal, Henry leaned back, holding his tea. "It's strange," he murmured. "You haven't asked a single thing about my fortune, or my business, or any of it." Grace smiled. "That's because I'm not here for any of it. I'm here for the food, and the person who eats it." Henry looked at her, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes. And for the first time since Eleanor, he felt something stir, a spark not dulled by grief, but lit by comfort, presence, and something even deeper, hope. Saturday morning brought an unexpected burst of sunshine to London, the kind that felt rare and precious, even more so after a stormy night. Grace was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Henry walked in. not in his usual tailored suit, but in a navy jumper and simple wool coat. It was the first time she'd seen him dressed casually, and something about it made him look 10 years younger. "I thought you'd be sleeping in today," she said, whisking eggs. Henry shrugged. "Didn't feel like it. You mentioned something earlier in the week." "A market?" Grace turned to face him. "Borough Market, it's not far. They've got everything, fresh bread, cheese, fish, flowers. I go when I can." He hesitated. "Would you mind if I came along?" Grace blinked, surprised. "You want to come with me? To the market? I'd like to see where all this food is really coming from," he said almost playfully. She smiled. "Then let me just grab my coat." The walk to the market was brisk, the streets still drying from last night's rain. People passed by, wrapped in scarves, sipping takeaway coffee. Henry kept his head slightly down, not hiding, but not inviting recognition either. The market itself was alive with color and noise. Vendors shouted their specials, children laughed, and the scent of spices, meats, and baked goods mingled in the air. Grace moved through the crowd with ease, greeting some sellers by name. Henry followed closely, visibly intrigued. He examined wheels of cheese with genuine curiosity, tasted jam from a small batch producer, and sampled a piece of focaccia still warm from the oven. At one stall, Grace pointed out a particular vendor. "That's Martha. She grows the best rosemary I've ever used." Martha, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and soil-stained hands, waved at Grace, and then looked at Henry. "And who's this, then?" she asked with a sly grin. "Friend," Grace replied easily. "Learning about real food for the first time," Henry laughed. "That's not far from the truth." They spent nearly an hour wandering the aisles. Henry bought more than he expected: a jar of honey from Kent, a sourdough loaf, a wedge of strong English cheddar. He even picked out flowers, lavender and white peonies, though he offered no explanation when Grace raised an eyebrow. As they left, she said, "You didn't have to buy all that." "I wanted to," he replied. "There's something different about choosing it yourself, like you're connected to it." Grace nodded, quietly pleased. Walking back, she glanced at him. "You're not what I expected." He looked at her, curious. "And what did you expect?" She shrugged. "A man with too much money and not enough time." He smiled. "I was. Maybe I'm not anymore." And as they turned the final corner toward the mansion, flowers in hand and sourdough under his arm, Henry Whitmore, the loneliest billionaire in England, felt, for once, like just a man walking home. The idea came on a Sunday evening, as Grace arranged a platter of cheese and fruit in the dining room. The rain had returned, soft and constant, tapping gently against the tall windows like a metronome for reflection. Henry stood near the fireplace, wineglass in hand, watching the flames dance. There was something on his mind. Grace sensed it. She didn't speak, only waited. After a long moment, he finally said, "I was thinking, it might be time to open the house again." She turned, surprised. "You mean guests?" He nodded slowly. "It used to be filled with people. Eleanor loved hosting dinners, neighbors, colleagues, friends from school. After she died, I just couldn't face the noise." Grace said nothing, only watched him closely. "I shut the doors, let the staff go. People stopped calling, stopped dropping by, and I let them. But the silence," he sighed. "The silence grew heavy." Grace offered a soft smile. "Then let's lift it." That week, she sent out a handful of simple invitations, handwritten, not digital. A few to neighbors, one to Oliver and his wife, another to a retired art teacher who once lived across the street but hadn't stepped into the mansion in over 5 years. Henry insisted on keeping it intimate. No formal dress, no speeches, just food, warmth, and conversation. When Saturday arrived, Grace transformed the dining room with soft lighting, fresh flowers from the market, and the aroma of roasted lamb and rosemary potatoes drifting through the halls. At 7 o'clock sharp, The doorbell rang. Henry opened it himself. The first guests looked momentarily startled. There he stood, the elusive billionaire, not in a suit, but in a cable-knit sweater, sleeves casually rolled. He greeted each guest personally, offering handshakes and genuine smiles. Laughter echoed down the hall. Wine was poured. People who hadn't seen one another in years sat side by side, sharing stories like no time had passed. Grace floated in and out of the dining room, never the center of attention, but always the source of it, refilling dishes, warming bread, placing extra spoons without being asked. Henry sat at the head of the table, watching it all unfold with quiet awe. At one point, the retired art teacher, Mrs. Linwood, looked at him and said, "I never thought I'd be inside this house again. It's wonderful to hear it alive." Henry smiled. So did I. And as the evening wound down, guests lingered near the fire, coats still in hand, unwilling to leave too soon. When the door finally closed behind the last goodbye, Henry turned to Grace in the now quiet hallway. "This house," he said, voice low. "It was never the size that made it grand. It was the people." Grace nodded, gently brushing a crumb from her apron. "Then let's keep filling it." "Do." And with that, the house that had once felt like a museum of grief took its first full breath in years and exhaled joy. The morning after the dinner party, the mansion felt different. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, catching the edge of a wineglass left on the sideboard. The scent of lavender from the flower arrangements lingered in the air, mixing with the faint traces of roasted lamb and cinnamon pears. It felt like a lived-in home, not just a preserved shell. Henry sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee as Grace flipped pancakes on the stove. Neither spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The kind of silence that had once weighed heavily on Henry now felt peaceful, until Oliver arrived. He entered the kitchen with a folder in hand, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said with a polite nod. "Sorry to interrupt." Grace stepped away discreetly, offering Henry a quick smile before disappearing into the pantry. Oliver sat down across from him and slid the folder forward. "You should see this." Henry opened it. Inside were printed documents, financial projections, and a cover letter with a familiar logo. He read it once, then again, slower this time. "They're offering how much?" he asked, eyebrows lifting slightly. "Nearly double market value. They want the property, the land, everything. An American group looking to convert the estate into an exclusive boutique hotel." Henry leaned back in his chair. "Of course they do. It's a strong offer, Henry, clean terms, and let's be honest. Before Grace arrived, you would have accepted this without blinking." Henry didn't respond immediately. His eyes drifted toward the window, where he could see a corner of the garden and the reflection of sunlight bouncing off the stone path. Oliver continued, "You could take it, move into something modern, travel, start over somewhere new." Henry folded his arms. "I don't want modern. I don't want to start over. I want what I had last night, warmth, people, meaning." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "And her?" Henry looked at him then, steady, certain. "Especially her." Silence passed between them, the kind that held more truth than any argument. "I'll give you time," Oliver said finally, standing up, "but they'll want an answer by the end of the week." After Oliver left, Grace returned. She saw the papers still open and paused. "Something important?" she asked carefully. Henry looked at her, really looked at her. "They want to buy this place," he said. "Turn it into a hotel." Grace's expression remained calm. "And will you sell it?" He shook his head slowly. "Not if it means losing what I've just found." She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. "Then I suppose we'll need to keep building something worth staying for." Henry smiled. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was holding on to a memory. He was building a future. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the way they used to be. Henry found himself caught between stillness and thought. The offer from the American group sat untouched on his desk, a silent temptation sealed inside a manila folder. He hadn't told Oliver his final answer, but in his heart the decision was already made. And yet, he hesitated. It wasn't about the money. Henry had more than he could ever spend. Nor was it about the property. He had dozens, but this house, this home, had begun to mean something different now. It wasn't just brick and timber. It was Grace's laughter echoing from the kitchen, the smell of baking bread at dawn, the tea poured each evening in comforting silence. Still, a whisper of doubt crept in. What if this was temporary? What if she left? What if this warmth was borrowed, not built? One evening, he came down late. The kitchen was empty. A single plate of stew sat covered on the table with a note beside it. Thought you might be hungry. G. He stood there for several minutes, staring at the handwriting. Something about it, its simplicity, its kindness, brought an ache to his chest. Not of grief this time, but of recognition. It had been so long since someone had cared without asking for anything in return. Henry didn't eat. He walked out into the garden instead, letting the chill night air bite at his skin. He wandered down the stone path, past the old oak tree, and finally sat on the bench Eleanor once loved. He used to come here to remember her. Now he came with someone else on his mind. From somewhere in the house, soft music played. Grace's playlist, no doubt, a mix of old jazz and acoustic melodies. It drifted through the air like a memory being written in real time. When he returned inside, Grace was still awake, reading by the fireplace. "You didn't eat," she said softly, closing her book. "I wasn't sure I was hungry," he replied. She tilted her head. "And now?" He looked at her, his voice unusually quiet. "I'm not sure what I'm doing. I've spent so long in silence that I don't know how to move forward when it's not empty anymore." Grace stood slowly and walked over. She didn't touch him. She simply said, "Then start with one step, one choice. One moment that feels honest." Henry nodded but said nothing more. The next morning, Oliver received a single text. "Tell them I'm not selling." No explanations, no negotiations, just a choice, a step. And that evening, Henry sat down at the kitchen table before Grace could call him, ready, finally, to share the quiet not as a shield, but as something sacred. The following day, Henry felt lighter, not because anything outside had changed, but because something inside him had. For the first time in years, he wasn't stuck between past and future. He had chosen the present, not out of convenience or obligation, but conviction. He didn't sell the house, and more importantly, he didn't run. Still, the question lingered. Now what? He had spent decades building an empire, signing deals in glass towers, attending galas with empty smiles. But now, sitting in his kitchen with the scent of Grace's lavender soap and the hum of the kettle in the background, Henry realized something startling. He wanted more than comfort. He wanted meaning. That afternoon, as Grace prepared a lemon tart by the window, Henry stood watching her, hands in his pockets. "I've been thinking," he said. She looked up, wiping flour from her fingers. "Always dangerous." He smiled faintly. "This house, it feels different now, and it's because of you." Grace tilted her head. "You've changed it too." "I don't want it to go back to how it was," he continued. "And I don't just mean the silence, I mean the emptiness." She nodded, but said nothing. She sensed something more was coming. "I want to create something. Together," Henry said. "Something that isn't about profit or property lines. Something that feeds people in the way you've fed me." Grace blinked, slightly startled. "You mean a restaurant?" he said. "Not just any restaurant. Something small, intimate, built around your food, your stories, a place where people feel seen when they walk through the door." Grace leaned back against the counter, searching his face for doubt and finding none. "You're serious?" "I haven't been this serious in years," Henry said. "You gave me something I didn't even realize I'd lost. The feeling of home. I want to give that to others. With you." She stared at him, the lemon tart forgotten. And then, slowly, she nodded. If we do this, we do it right. No pretension, no fuss, real food, real people. He stepped closer, voice low. Real purpose. Their eyes locked. It wasn't romantic, not quite, not yet, but it was something deeper. A quiet agreement between two souls who had both known loneliness and had found peace in the simplest of things. The following morning, Henry called his lawyer to discuss the zoning permissions for a small property he already owned in Notting Hill, a quaint, ivy-covered space that once held an art gallery. Grace began pulling out old recipes from her grandmother's collection, carefully rewriting them by hand. There were no investors, no board meetings, no consultants, just flour, fire, and faith. The decision had been made. And it wasn't just about a restaurant, it was about starting over, together. They named it Hearth and Home. The name came from Grace, but the moment she said it aloud in the kitchen, Henry felt it strike something deep inside him, like a memory that had been waiting patiently to be named. The space they chose in Notting Hill was small and old, but full of potential. Exposed brick walls, wooden beams, and large front windows that let in soft morning light. A former art gallery, it had stood empty for years. Now, it would become something new. They worked side by side for weeks. Grace handled the kitchen plans, hand-picking cookware, sketching layouts, and calling in favors from her old culinary school contacts. Henry, for the first time in decades, rolled up his sleeves and got his hands dirty. He stripped old floorboards, helped repaint the walls, and argued with the city council over a planter box he insisted must stay by the front door. More than once, passers-by stopped to stare at the billionaire with paint on his collar. But Henry didn't care. He was finally building something that felt real. They kept the menu simple: stews and roasts, hand-rolled pastries, seasonal soups, breads baked fresh each morning, tea served in mismatched porcelain cups. Grace's mother's scone recipe became the centerpiece. Every dish came with a story. Every corner of the restaurant was filled with warmth. The night before the grand opening, they sat together at one of the tables, surrounded by the glow of hanging bulbs and the scent of lavender and wood oil. Grace looked around the space, her expression soft. "This doesn't feel like a restaurant." Henry smiled. "Good." She turned to him. "Do you ever miss the old world? The meetings, the skyscrapers, the handshakes in marble offices?" He considered the question, then shook his head. "That world never missed me back." She nodded in understanding. Opening day arrived on a rainy Thursday. They weren't sure if anyone would come. They hadn't advertised much, just word of mouth, a handwritten sign in the window, and a quiet hum around the neighborhood. But by noon, the line stretched around the corner. The first customer, an elderly woman with silver hair and a tartan umbrella, stepped inside, sniffed the air, and said, "It smells like my childhood in here." Grace served her tea. Henry carried out the soup himself. The woman smiled. "I haven't been served by a man with a fortune this large since the Queen's Jubilee." He laughed, and for once it wasn't awkward. It was easy, natural. That night, when they closed the doors, exhausted but full of joy, Grace turned to Henry and whispered, "You did it." He looked at her, eyes tired but content. "We did it." Hearth and Home wasn't just a name, it was a promise. And they were just getting started. Winter arrived softly in London that year, with misty mornings, breath-clouded air, and the distant chime of bells from hidden churches. Snow had yet to fall, but the cold had settled in like a guest intending to stay. Inside Hearth and Home, however, the cold stood no chance. The restaurant had found its rhythm. Mornings began with the scent of cinnamon porridge and mulled cider. Lunch brought in couples escaping the chill, eager for steaming bowls of leek and potato soup. And by evening, candlelight flickered across tables, the windows glowing amber against the grey outside. Henry had taken to standing near the front, greeting guests by name. He no longer wore his tailored suits. Instead, he preferred jumpers, and rolled up sleeves. His hands bore small cuts from slicing bread, and his fingernails often carried traces of flour. He had never looked more alive. Grace, in the kitchen, was radiant in her own quiet way. A conductor behind the scenes. She tweaked recipes as the weeks passed, always in tune with what people needed. When the days grew darker, she added ginger cake and shepherd's pie. When a regular's mother fell ill, she delivered soup by hand. When a child came in crying from the cold, she handed him a warm scone with extra jam. No charge. They had become something rare, not just a restaurant, but a refuge. One evening, just before closing, snow began to fall. The first flakes danced through the street lamp light, collecting gently on the pavement. Grace stepped outside in her apron, wiping her hands on a tea towel, and stared upward. Henry joined her, 2 mugs of hot chocolate in hand. "First snow," she said softly. "Looks like something out of a painting." They stood in silence, sipping slowly, watching the world soften under the white. Grace glanced at him. "You seem still." "I feel still," he replied, "but in the best way. Like I'm no longer running." She nodded, understanding. He turned to her then, more serious. "Do you ever wonder how all of this happened? How something so simple as a job changed everything?" Grace smiled. "It wasn't just a job, Henry. It was a chance. For both of us." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Not velvet, not flashy, just plain wood. Inside, nestled on cotton, sat a tiny silver key. "To the house?" she asked, surprised. He nodded. "To the front door, to the kitchen, to everything. I want this to be your home too, not just in words, but in truth." Grace said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the key. The snow kept falling, silent and steady. And in that moment, no crowds, no applause, no headlines, 2 people stood in the heart of London, no longer lonely, no longer lost. Just home. Spring came slowly that year. The ivy along the Notting Hill storefront began to bloom again, soft green leaves peeking through winter's remains. Daffodils lined the footpaths, and Hearth and Home opened its windows for the first time in months, letting in the breeze along with the familiar smells of baking and rosemary. Inside, not much had changed, and that was the point. The mismatched china, the scuffed wooden floor, the chalkboard menus filled with daily specials. But for those who came often, there were subtle additions. Photographs on the walls, handwritten notes from guests, a small bookshelf in the corner filled with cookbooks and old novels, and behind the counter always Grace and Henry, not as boss and employee, but as partners, as something deeper, though neither felt the need to define it too quickly. What they had was steady, quiet, real. The restaurant had gained attention, a few glowing reviews in food blogs, a short piece in the Evening Standard, but they didn't expand, didn't franchise. They turned down investors. "This place isn't meant to grow wide," Grace told one curious journalist. "It's meant to grow deep." And it did. They hosted a soup night every Wednesday for neighbors in need. Henry, once allergic to publicity, now taught a weekly baking class to children from the local primary school. He showed them how to knead dough, how to fold pastry, how to measure by touch instead of exact weight, the way Grace had taught him. He still kept his properties, still handled the occasional high-profile deal, but when people spoke of Henry Whitmore now, it wasn't with the same tone. Not just the billionaire, the man with the small restaurant in Notting Hill, the man who laughs easily, the man who changed when he let someone in. On Sunday evening, just before closing, a familiar elderly woman entered the restaurant. She was the first customer who had ever walked through the door, the one with the tartan umbrella. She took her usual seat near the window and ordered tea and a scone. Grace brought it to her with a gentle smile. "You know," the woman said, stirring her tea, "places like this don't happen by accident." Grace tilted her head. "No, they're built, not with money, but with care, bit by bit. Bite by bite." She glanced toward Henry, who was clearing a table, laughing with a young couple. He used to look haunted, the woman whispered. "Now he looks found." Grace followed her gaze and smiled. "He is." As the last guests trickled out and the lights dimmed, Henry locked the front door, turned to Grace and said, "Tea?" "In the garden," she replied. And so they walked out back, 2 mugs in hand, the stars above just starting to appear. Not all stories end with fireworks or grand gestures. Some end quietly, with a key, a meal, and the soft, undeniable truth that home isn't a place. It's a person, and sometimes it starts in a kitchen. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't leave without letting us know. Share in the comments. What does home mean to you? And if you believe, like I do, that connection, kindness, and a warm meal can change a life. Like this video, share it with someone who needs comfort, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. I'll be waiting to read your comment, and don't forget, some of the most powerful changes begin with something as simple as a plate of food.